David Mullen's life had been slowly unraveling for the past 2 years, but it all came crashing down the day his son Ethan was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive disease. Ethan was just 6 years old, a quiet boy with soft brown eyes and a gentle smile that could light up even David's darkest days. Ever since David's wife passed away from cancer, Ethan had been his entire world. David worked long hours at a small hardware store, doing everything he could to make sure his son had a good life, but now all his efforts felt meaningless. The doctor said the treatment existed, but it was expensive, far beyond anything David could ever afford. Health insurance would not cover the experimental procedure, and charity organizations had turned him away, citing limited funds and countless other desperate families. David found himself sinking deeper into hopelessness as the days passed. His savings vanished quickly under the weight of hospital bills, medications, and care. He sold his car, pawning off almost everything he owned, just to keep Ethan's treatments going a little longer. But the disease was moving faster than the money could come in. David took on crushing debts, borrowing from friends, banks, and anyone who would listen, but doors were slamming shut everywhere. His boss at the hardware store offered to advance his paycheck, but it barely made a dent. It became a painful routine: work, hospital, work, hospital. And in the middle of it all, Ethan's quiet strength slowly began to fade. David's mind became consumed with guilt and fear. He spent sleepless nights pacing the living room, wondering what kind of father could not save his own child. He looked for any possible way out, even exploring dangerous and illegal jobs that promised fast money, but none of them ever materialized. He was running out of time, and he knew it. Ethan's doctors were beginning to prepare him for the worst. They told him to focus on making his son's remaining days as comfortable as possible, to think about saying goodbye. But David wasn't ready to give up. He wasn't ready to let Ethan go. He began to wander the streets after his long shifts, visiting churches, looking for signs, for miracles. It was on one of these long, hopeless walks that he found a piece of paper folded and tucked beneath his apartment door. The handwriting was shaky and old, and the message was short: "There is someone who can help you. Visit the Church of Eternal Grace on the outskirts of town. Ask for Pastor Elijah." The note didn't make sense. David had never heard of the church or the pastor, but the words burned in his mind. Maybe someone had left it by mistake. Maybe it was a cruel joke. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the answer he had been desperately searching for. He kept the note in his pocket, reading it over and over as if it were a key to some hidden door. After a few days of hesitation, with no other options, and with Ethan's condition worsening, David finally decided to go. The directions led him to the far edge of town, where the streets grew quiet and empty. The church he found was old and crumbling, its sign nearly unreadable, covered in years of dirt and vines. Still, something pulled him forward. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the creak echoing through the empty hall. Dust floated in the sunlight, filtering through the cracked windows. There, sitting alone near the altar, was an elderly blind man in a tattered robe, waiting as if he had known David would come. This was Pastor Elijah, the man who would change David's life forever. David stood frozen at the entrance of the decaying church, unsure if he should step further inside. The air was thick with dust and silence, broken only by the faint sound of the old man breathing steadily near the altar. The man sat with his hands resting calmly on his lap, his face turned slightly as if he could see David, even though his clouded eyes made it clear he was blind. There was something about him that made David uneasy, but the weight of his son's sickness pushed him forward. He approached the man carefully, noticing the worn wooden cane lying beside him. Without asking, the blind man softly said that he had been expecting him. His voice was calm, smooth, and steady, like someone who had complete control over the situation. The man introduced himself as Pastor Elijah and spoke in a way that made David feel as if he had been watched for some time. David, desperate for any chance to save Ethan, poured out his story, how his son was dying, how he had no money, how all doors had been closed to him. Pastor Elijah listened silently, never interrupting, his blind gaze fixed straight ahead. When David finished, the pastor spoke of life's hidden layers, of things that ordinary people could not see. He explained that sometimes the pain people faced was not just bad luck or illness. It was the result of spiritual blockages, invisible chains that wrapped around a person's soul. The pastor's words were strange, but David clung to them. Because no one else had offered him hope, that the pastor told David that Ethan's sickness was not simply medical. According to him, Ethan's soul had been trapped by dark forces that were draining his life. Doctors could only see the surface, but the pastor claimed he could see deeper, into the spiritual realm. David's heart pounded as the pastor explained that the only way to save his son was through a sacred cleansing, a process that would break the chains and release Ethan's spirit from the grip of darkness. The pastor warned that this would not be easy and that the process would demand full trust and obedience. David, exhausted and desperate, agreed without hesitation. Over the next several weeks, David kept returning to the church. Pastor Elijah always sat in the same place, as if he never left. Each time David visited, the pastor gave him new instructions. He told David to cut all connections to the past. He was to destroy his wife's belongings, erase old photographs, and abandon anyone who might distract him from the spiritual path. The pastor said these steps were necessary to break the worldly attachments that kept the spiritual blockage in place. David, though confused, followed each instruction. Slowly, his life became emptier. He stopped speaking to friends, distanced himself from neighbors, and threw away everything that reminded him of his late wife. The pastor continued guiding him, saying that David was becoming more spiritually pure, preparing for the final ritual that would heal Ethan. As the weeks passed, David's mind began to shift. He believed that the world he had known was only a thin surface covering a deeper, hidden reality. The pastor's words sank into him, becoming his truth. He no longer questioned the strange requests, nor did he hesitate when asked to fast for days, leaving him physically weak but spiritually ready. As the pastor claimed, the final step, the pastor told him, would take place at a sacred river outside of town. At the right moment, David would need to perform an act of great faith to release his son from the invisible chains. The pastor assured him that Ethan would not die, but instead would be freed and returned to him, whole and healed. David's desperation had now transformed into complete, unquestioning belief. The man who had once fought with logic and reason had vanished. What remained was a father who trusted a blind stranger with everything. He had left his son's life. The day of the final ritual arrived, and David's mind was filled with a strange mixture of fear, hope, and determination. The pastor's words echoed in his thoughts, shaping his every move. David truly believed he was standing on the edge of a great spiritual battle. He had done everything the pastor told him. He had destroyed his wife's belongings, disconnected from his old life, and stripped himself of the attachments that pastor Elijah called distractions. He was now fully committed to what he believed was a sacred mission to save his son. The pastor's final instructions were clear. David was to take Ethan to the sacred river just outside of town at sunset. The pastor had described the exact spot, saying the ritual had to begin at the precise moment the sun touched the mountain's edge. The water, according to the pastor, would act as a spiritual gateway. David was to hold Ethan under the surface until the invisible chains were broken and the dark force released its grip. The pastor promised that David would see a sign, a shift in the air, a sudden calm, and at that moment, Ethan would be freed and returned to him, healed and whole. David prepared for the ritual carefully. He packed a small bag with a change of clothes for Ethan, a towel, and the crumpled note that had first led him to the pastor. In his heart, he believed this would be the last painful step before his son's life was saved. When Ethan asked where they were going, David told him they were going to a special place, a place where they would fix everything. Ethan, too weak to argue, simply nodded and rested his head against his father's shoulder as they made their way to the river. The sun was low in the sky when they arrived at the quiet, remote spot the pastor had described. The river was still, its surface shining like glass in the fading light. There were no other people around. The silence of the place made it feel almost sacred. David's hands trembled as he carried Ethan to the water's edge. He tried to push away his fear, holding tightly to the pastor's promise that this was the only path to saving his son. As the sun touched the mountain's edge, David stepped into the cold water, holding Ethan close to his chest. His heart pounded as he remembered every word the pastor had spoken about faith, obedience, and the spiritual chains that must be broken. When the moment came, David slowly lowered Ethan into the river. The boy's body tensed in the cold, but David whispered to himself that this was the path to healing. He held Ethan under the surface, waiting for the sign. Seconds stretched endlessly. David's arms began to shake, his grip tightening as he waited for the shift in the air, the promised signal that the chains had been broken. But nothing came. The river remained still. The sky remained silent. Panic started to creep into David's chest, but he clung to the belief that he had to keep going, that the pastor would not have lied to him. Minutes passed. Ethan's small body went limp in David's arms. The silence of the river pressed in around him. Fear and confusion exploded inside him as he pulled Ethan's lifeless body from the water. There was no sign, no miracle, no healing. Only the terrible weight of what he had just done. David screamed into the empty sky, falling to his knees on the riverbank, clutching his son's body in disbelief. His mind raced back to the pastor's promises, the rituals, the instructions, all the steps that now seemed like a cruel trap. Grief swallowed him whole as the crushing realization set in. He had drowned his own son, believing it was the only way to save him. The pastor's words had led him here, but now the pastor was nowhere to be found. David's world collapsed in the cold silence of the riverbank. His hands trembled as he held Ethan's still body close to his chest, rocking back and forth as if his touch alone could bring him back. His mind screamed for this to be a nightmare, but the weight of his son in his arms was real, unmovable, final. He stared at the water, waiting for some sign, something to prove the pastor's promise had not been a lie. But there was nothing. Only the wind moving softly through the trees, and the steady sound of the river's flow, indifferent to what had just happened. When the weight of what he had done crushed through his confusion, David's instincts told him to find Pastor Elijah. Immediately, he gathered Ethan's body in his arms and staggered back to his car, his mind racing with questions. How could this be? Had he made a mistake? Did he hold Ethan under too long? Or had the pastor tricked him from the very beginning? David's pulse quickened with a new purpose. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He drove recklessly through the winding streets, ignoring traffic signals and honking cars as he rushed back to the church. As he arrived, he stumbled out of the vehicle, clutching Ethan tightly, running to the church doors. But something was wrong. The church looked abandoned, far more than it had when he first visited. The sign was broken, the windows were completely boarded up, and a thick layer of dust and dirt covered everything. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, stepping into a hollow, lifeless building. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and neglect. The pews were broken, covered in years of dust, and patches of the ceiling had collapsed. The altar where the pastor had always sat was empty. There were no signs that anyone had been there in years. David stumbled through the building, calling out for Pastor Elijah, but only his own echo answered him. Desperation clawed at him as he searched every room, every corner, but the pastor had vanished. There were no personal items, no signs of life, nothing to prove that Pastor Elijah had ever been there. His chest tightened as his mind spiraled into confusion. Had he been hallucinating all along? Was the pastor a product of his grief and desperation? But the instructions, the rituals, they had felt so real. The meetings, the voice, the blind man waiting for him, all of it had seemed undeniable. David dropped to his knees in the middle of the dust-covered church, still clutching Ethan's cold body, his breath shaking as he realized he might never find the answers. His belief, once so strong, now shattered into something dark and hollow. He had trusted the wrong person, or perhaps something worse than a person. When the authorities arrived, they found David sitting silently on the church steps, holding his son's lifeless body in his arms. He offered no resistance, no words. Only a blank stare as the officers gently took Ethan from him and led him away. Investigators quickly grew puzzled by the strange details of David's story. The Church of Eternal Grace had been abandoned for over a decade. The building had been condemned years earlier, and no records could place anyone named Pastor Elijah there in recent times. When police dug deeper, they found that the church had closed after a tragic accident involving a man named Elijah Harper, an old pastor who had lost his eyesight in a car crash years before the church's closure. Reports showed that Pastor Elijah had died shortly after the accident. There were no records of him ever living in town afterward, no signs he had ever met David. Yet David was sure he had spoken to him. Week after week, inside that church, detectives interviewed neighbors, churchgoers, and anyone connected to the old building, but no one had seen the pastor recently. Forensic teams found no fingerprints, no footprints, no physical evidence that anyone else had been in the church. David's story stood alone, without proof, without explanation. The pastor who had guided him so carefully through each step had vanished like a shadow. And in the silence that followed, all that remained was a father and the unspeakable act he could not undo. The investigation that followed gripped the entire town. Reporters flooded the streets, chasing a story that seemed to blur the lines between reality and illusion. A father had killed his own son under the belief that he was saving him, following instructions from a man no one could find. The case quickly became one of the most puzzling incidents the town had ever faced. David Mullen was arrested and charged, but his story continued to confuse everyone involved. He refused to deny what he had done, yet he insisted that Pastor Elijah had guided him every step of the way. Police continued to search for any trace of the blind pastor. They combed through old church records, personal files, and historical archives. They discovered that Elijah Harper had indeed served as the pastor of the Church of Eternal Grace many years ago. He had gone blind after a car accident and had passed away shortly after the church closed down. His obituary confirmed the details. But the impossible part was that David described Elijah exactly as he looked before his death, down to the cane and the soft, commanding voice. David had never met the man before. There were no shared connections, no family ties, and no clear way he could have known these details. Still, David remained firm. He was certain Pastor Elijah had spoken to him, guided him, and promised his son would be saved. Forensic teams searched the church thoroughly. Dust patterns, undisturbed for years, covered the pews and floors. No recent activity was found. The building had been silent and empty, as if no one had entered it for a decade. No fingerprints other than David's were discovered. The church's doors had rusted hinges, suggesting they had not been opened in many years. The neighbors confirmed they had not seen anyone in or around the church. It was as though David had been alone the entire time. Detectives retrieved security footage from the nearby roads and the river area. One particular clip disturbed the investigators the most. It showed David walking toward the river with Ethan in his arms, talking aloud, sometimes pausing as if listening to someone who was not there. His hand would rise as if responding to unseen instructions. No one else appeared in the footage. The images seemed to support the theory that David had been entirely alone during the entire event. Psychologists were brought in to examine David's mental state. They concluded that he may have suffered from an extreme form of grief-induced psychosis. His desperation, isolation, and overwhelming guilt had possibly driven him to create a powerful hallucination, one so vivid that it became real in his mind. Some experts believed David's visits to the abandoned church had been moments where his fractured mind filled the silence with the voice of the blind pastor, guiding him toward a tragic conclusion. Yet, not everyone agreed. Some investigators, disturbed by the consistency in David's story and his precise knowledge of Elijah Harper, began to question whether something else had happened. Could David have encountered something unexplainable, something that wore the image of the long-dead pastor to lure him into the horrific act? The absence of physical evidence left just enough room for that lingering doubt. The court eventually found David guilty, sentencing him to psychiatric care rather than prison. His mental state was too fragile, too lost, for the judge to see him as anything other than a broken man consumed by grief and manipulation. David remained silent most of the time, sitting quietly in his room, sometimes staring at nothing, other times whispering to someone no one else could see. In the years that followed, the case became a dark story told in hushed tones, a tale of a blind pastor who may or may not have existed, a father who believed he was saving his son, and a town left to wonder if madness alone could explain the tragedy, or if something far more sinister had been at play all along.